Aden Polydoros is an author of young adult dark fantasy and gothic horror novels and has a bachelor's degree in English from Northern Arizona University. His most recent novel, The City Beautiful, was declared a best young adult book of 2021 by New York Public Library, BookPage, Buzzfeed, and Tor.com, and was the winner of the 2022 Sidney Taylor Book Award for Young Adult Fiction. His forthcoming gothic fantasy novel, Bone Weaver, comes out in September 2022 from Inkyard Press and HarperCollins. Ava Reid is the indie best-selling and international best-selling author of The Wolf and the Woodsman, out now, Juniper and Thorn, and A Study in Drowning, which will be out soon in 2023. She was born in Manhattan and raised right across the river in Hoboken, New Jersey, but currently lives in Palo Alto. She has a degree in political science from Barnard College, focusing on religion and ethnic nationalism. Rebecca Podos' debut novel, The Mystery of Hollow Places, was a Junior Library Guild selection and a Barnes & Noble Best Young Adult Book of 2016. Her second book, Like Water, won the 2018 Lambda Literary Award for the LGBTQ Children's and Young Adults. Her latest releases are Fools in Love, a co-edited young adult anthology with Ashley Herring Blake, and the young adult fantasy novel From Dust a Flame. An agent at the Reese Literary Agency in Boston, she can be found on her website, which we will send in the chat. Catherine Locke is the author of The Girl with the Red Balloon, a 2018 Sidney Taylor Honor Book and 2018 Carolyn W. Field Honor Book, as well as The Spy with the Red Balloon. They are the co-editor and contributor to It's a Whole Spiel, Love, Latkes, and Other Jewish Stories, a contributor to Unbroken, 13 Stories Starring Disabled Teens, and Out Now, Where We Go Again, and co-editor of This Is Our Rainbow, 16 Stories of Her, Him, Them, and Us. They are also the author of the picture books, Bedtime for Superheroes, and How to Be Friends with a Dragon. They can be found online at catherinelockbooks.com, which we will also be sending in the chat, and we will also send their Twitter and Instagram handles so you can easily find them online. And last but certainly not least, Allison Saft is the New York Times and indie best-selling author of eerie romantic fantasies, Down Comes the Night, and A Far Wilder Magic. After receiving her MA in English Literature from Tulane University, she moved from the Gulf Coast to the West Coast, where she spends her time hiking the redwoods and practicing aerial skills. We are so excited to have them all here tonight, and I'm now going to let them take it away.
Yay. I am so excited for this.
Yes, thank you so much for having us, RJ Julia. Becca, you want me to kick it off?
Yeah, we have our order of questions that we're rotating through, but again, anyone who has questions for us, please drop them into the chat because we would love to get to as many as possible.
Okay, I'm sorry that my camera got a little dim. It turns out the ring light was making my eyes spasm, so fun times. I'm going to start by asking everybody what their latest book is about. And Ava, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So my latest book, Juniper and Thorn, is a gothic horror retelling of the Grimm's fairy tale, The Juniper Tree, set in Victorian era Odessa, Ukraine. That's my little spiel.
The perfect spiel. Aden?
Yeah, my novel, The City Beautiful, came out last year. It's a queer historical Jewish fantasy / gothic horror, and it's about a boy who's possessed by the Dybbuk of his roommate, and he has to find the man responsible for killing him before the spirit claims his body for good.
Excellent. Allison?
Hey, my latest book is called A Far Wilder Magic, and it is a YA fantasy romance about two outcasts, a alchemist and a sharpshooter, who have to team up for a hunt to kill the last living mythical beast.
Excellent. And Becca?
Hi, yeah, my latest book, From Dust to Flame, is a Sapphic Jewish, mostly contemporary fantasy. following a girl on the eve of her 17th birthday who wakes up every day with a new magical transformation and has to trace the source back to her family roots. And it spans basically from World War II era Prague into the present day, and throws in the Golem of Prague, some Shedim, some Iberim, and basically every fun Jewish monster that I could cram into it. That's my book.
Cool. I'm gonna talk about This Rebel Heart, but does everyone have their books with them? Because I think that we may have the best YA covers.
I can look up the cover of my book on my phone.
Oh, Becca.
I have one, but it's not the official cover. It's the book
Guys,
cover.
friends.
Oh, I hadn't seen
Oh
that.
no. I'm putting everyone on the spot. I should have told you this before. But
This wasn't in the notes.
I just think that our covers are like some of my favorite covers that I've just seen in the last couple of years, and we are all very, very lucky. This Rebel Heart is my latest release in my first novel since 2018. It is the story of a young Jewish girl who is a Holocaust survivor who gets swept up in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and has to decide whether she's going to use the magic of the city and her family's history with the city to fight for Hungary or to let it burn to the ground. Okay.
It's great.
It's really, it has a lot in common with From Dust to Flame, which we didn't know until we both had published them and read each other's books.
On like a scene by scene level. And I think, so I've read everybody's books here, and I think it's fascinating the things that they do have in common, because moving on to our second question, we're writing across the fantasy genre, but we have contemporary fantasy, we have historical fantasy, and I think really excitingly, we have second world fantasy, books that might never even mention the word Jewish, but they're all Jewish fantasy. And so I guess my question is, what do we think is like the core of Jewish fantasy as a genre? What makes a story Jewish fantasy? I'm going to call on Katie to go first. Oh, are we not doing that? Okay.
We can do that. I think this is potentially controversial. I think Jewish fantasy is written by Jewish authors who self-identify as Jewish, are not, regardless of what other people may or may not consider them. I say that as for those who are like, why is Catherine being vague? I'm a patrilineal Jew, so there are people who don't consider me Jewish. I'm Jewish. I identify as Jewish. I write Jewish books. So I kind of think that that is the core of a Jewish fantasy, that regardless of whether Judaism is on the page or not, sounds of Philadelphia are outside, but regardless of whether Judaism is on the page or not, a Jewish writer is going to be carrying in so many values of what Jewishness means to them, that the book is, the fantasy elements in the whole book are inherently Jewish.
Well, I agree with that. I think if you self-identify as Jewish, and if you would identify your book as Jewish, regardless of the words you use, the history you pull from, what kind of values are reflected on the page, or what kind of religion your character does or does not practice, if you're Jewish and you call your book Jewish, then I think it's Jewish.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, I think it's interesting what you said, Becca, that like you can have Jewish fantasy without ever using the word Jewish. And that is the case with A Far Wilder Magic, although I kind of, just switch the name. In everything but name, it is Judaism. But yeah, I feel like you say, there's just like some things that bleed onto the page without you realizing in some ways. Like the things that I put in there that have been picked up by readers have always been extremely touching to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jewish fantasy has been kind of, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, but like has been pretty foundational for me in terms of like reconnecting with a piece of myself I hadn't engaged with as much before finding these kinds of books.
I feel like writing Jewish fantasy makes me have to put words to things that I know but have never articulated before, like my feelings about like our obligations in times of conflict and our obligation in times of moral strife, and you know, what it means to be a good person, and like the Jewish concepts of that I know, but I had never had to articulate and write down, and not just kind of fumble around vaguely and be like, you know, and that actually had to say it. And I think that that has been, like you said, Allison, like really helpful in cementing my Jewish identity and expanding my Jewish identity.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm sure we'll touch on challenges and stuff later too. I think one of the challenges of doing that is that I was constantly coming up against the expectations of like a Christian normative readership, where they would just assume things were completely universal, you know, questions about ethics and what makes a good person. And they wouldn't, when I would, you know, have a different take on that, I would get like some pretty negative feedback. So it was interesting, and that forced me to kind of clarify in my own mind, like, what do I really believe about, you know, ethics and morality, and how much of that is influenced by my heritage.
Yeah, I would definitely agree there. That's something I found in The City Beautiful as well, questions regarding, for example, Christianity's views on sin, or on, you know, same-sex homosexuality, or on, you know, just how thoughts themselves are seen as sinful. I found myself, as I was writing Autor's character, confronting these ideas on a page-by-page basis, and really digging into, okay, what would he have believed back then, and how would he filter his own sexuality, his own experiences, through the lens of someone who grew up, you know, in Victorian era Romania, as someone who is Jewish, who's observant. And it was very interesting to explore both in terms of his identity, and in understanding how my own identity and relationship with Judaism influences my writing, because I'm not religious. I'm from an interfaith family, and it really forced me to consider what views I considered Jewish and what views I thought were Jewish but aren't, and really just approach that in my writing.
Yeah, I found that I'm also from an interfaith family, and I found that particularly true when I have to like navigate the way I've internalized forgiveness in particular. I think that's one of the biggest places there's like divergence, and there, like, forgiveness is a huge part of this rebel heart, and I had to like really thread the needle of like what I believe versus like what Sheila would believe, and what her father would believe, and what the people around her would believe. So because I think that there's a lot of Catholicism in how I view forgiveness, and like the burden of forgiveness.
Yeah, that's something I approached in the Gollum story I've been working on, because I didn't want to have the main characters forgive, you know, Nazi collaborators, for instance, and so one of them does commit a murder that's not in self-defense, that's in retribution. And I was discussing this with my Jewish editor, that, you know, if this were a different kind of story, he would forgive this person, he would spare them, or do it in self-defense.
I think it's really fascinating.
Did we want to talk about our I know I love this discussion of like seems like the foundation of Jewish fantasy being this like kind of code of ethics and beliefs that kind of suffuse all elements of the work. I'm really curious also to hear about people's like what their first experience with Jewish fantasy was. For me, I think it was Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins, which is just like, I haven't read it in so many years, but it really sticks with me, like the art style. And I mean, kind of to the point of what we were talking about previously of like what makes a Jewish fantasy, like that story that has both elements in terms of like the folk hero, folk tale side of things, like folkloric, but also like the literal magic with these goblins and how they are defeated through like wit and I don't know, it's just really stuck with me. It's a lovely story. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what y'all have what your origin stories were.
I was going to say Devil's Arithmetic, but Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins must have been it. And also there was this, it's not really magic. I don't know if it's really magical, but there was a Hanukkah story called Latkes and Applesauce. Did anybody else also read the story about how a dog and cat magically show up on different nights of Hanukkah, and like they're named Latkes and Applesauce and they're adopted by this family, but they like find their way to the home in like the dark and the snow. And to me, that's also kind of magical because it's very unlikely. And everyone who knows me knows I'm an animal person. But I picked my Hebrew name from Devil's Arithmetic. So I was not given a Hebrew name at birth, and I went to Hebrew school and they were like, what's your Hebrew name? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they were like, okay, go home and pick one. And my dad was like, I don't know Hebrew names, like just figure it out on your own. You have the internet. The internet, it was like 1997. So the internet was like really bare bones.
You had to ask Jeeves and such.
Yeah, exactly. But I had just read Devil's Arithmetic. So I named myself Chaya after the character in Devil's Arithmetic. So that book is really special to me.
I have literally the exact same answer because I was gonna say Devil's Arithmetic, which was one of like, the first library books that I ever had access to were from my synagogue library, and like the little shelf of Jewish children's books, most of which were Holocaust books, including the Devil's Arithmetic. But I definitely remember that as like that fantastical element as the literal like portal to her family history and her identity, and like that fantastical element allowing her to connect to her roots and the things that shaped her family members, the things that shaped her, which there's definitely an element of that in From Dust to Flame. But it was for sure Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblin. I just like didn't even think about that as a fantasy story for some reason. But yeah, Herschel, classic of the genre.
Yeah, I don't know if this like more and more I've been thinking that this does count, but I am and always have been a really big like comic book superhero fan. And the more that I've thought about that and like learned about comic book history in America, I've learned that it was like created by Jewish American immigrants, and so many of the like superhero comic book values are just Jewish values. And this is something that goes pretty unremarked upon. I mean, you have like iconic Jewish comic book characters like Magneto. And if you've ever read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, it's basically a like fictionalization of this like history of, Jewish Americans building the comic book industry. So yeah, honestly, I would say my first Jewish fantasy book was like X-Men comics when I was a little kid. And I think that counts.
Legit, for sure.
Yeah, mine was probably The Shawl. It's a short story set during the Holocaust. But then, of course, later on, it was Sisters of the Winter Woods. I didn't really have the access to that much Jewish kid lit as a kid, except for Holocaust books. So those were pretty much my first introductions to the fantasy genre.
Yeah, and I think kind of going off of that, how has kind of the landscape of Jewish fantasy changed since we were kids, and how would we like to see that change going forward?
It's not just Holocaust books anymore.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest change. And that's been relatively recent. That's like the last 5 years. Like Jewish YA in particular has changed, and Jewish middle grade have changed so much. It's like amazing. It's like I couldn't have dreamt up, like it's just so many good books and so many great authors and people writing all different types of stories and writing complicated characters too. I think that's something we've seen like the last 2 years is like Jewish characters who are not perfect, Jewish characters who make mistakes, Jewish characters who maybe feed is the wrong word. That's the word I want to avoid. Jewish characters that sometimes have the same traits as anti-Semitic character or stereotypes that aren't anti-Semitic in their stories. You know, I think that is also super important, and I love seeing the change. It's been incredible. We're in like a renaissance of Jewish kid lit right now.
No, absolutely. The expansion from just like Holocaust-centric books, which I think we've all talked about and thought about. And I think too, what we were talking about earlier is Jewish fantasy being written by self-identifying Jewish authors. Whereas in the past, and like not very far in the past, you could have a non-Jewish author writing a Holocaust book and have it included on like all of the, like if there was a Jewish American Heritage Month book list, that would be on the list. I'm going the straight pajamas, or like I love Number the Stars, but I think, you know, we've talked about how it's you know, not necessarily something that should be on the Jewish book list. And I think there has been like a reclamation over the last couple of years, which is really awesome. And I would, in terms of progression, I would love to see that grow. And I would love to see us continue to write characters that we don't have to be so on guard because they are like morally questionable, or they don't make all of the right decisions based upon like Christian ethics and values and things like that. So I just love to see it keep going in the direction it's been going.
Yeah, I would also add it's just been wonderful seeing more Jewish books with intersecting identities, and I've really loved the increase in queer Jewish stories, especially genre books, because I felt like I would have loved those books so much as a teen, and I'm really excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing to me how many different Jewish stories we've seen across time and space, because I think one of the most like pervasive stereotypes about Jewish people and Judaism that like maybe isn't talked about as much is that it's this like esoteric ancient identity that is kind of stuck in time, and like it's like too difficult for like Gentiles to understand, and like so it's been really cool to see all these Jewish stories where like these Jewish characters, they're interwoven with the rest of the world, and they are changing with the times, and they're not this like secluded, isolated, you know, quote unquote weird like esoteric community. They're, you know, vibrant and dynamic and, you know, changing, you know, identity group.
Absolutely. I mean, similarly to Aden, after, you know, my, you know, Hanukkah picture book days as a kid, I didn't really encounter another Jewish fantasy until Spinning Silver. And I actually didn't go into that, like, it was 2017 before I was on any kind of book community situation, halcyon days. But I just picked it up because I loved Uprooted. And so I was like, oh, obviously I'm going to read her next book. And then when I realized it was about Jews, I was like, what is this emotion that I'm having that I like, and wasn't, like, to Ava's point, that they're like so integrated in this world. It was the first time I had seen a book with like a Jewish community, like depicting like Miriam's parents just like make me so soft when I think about it, and just like all of the like the holidays and the relationships. I don't know, I'm just gonna start Love Letter to Spinning Silver. Everybody read it if you haven't already. So I'm excited for more books like that. I mean, just more, I mean, especially secondary world fantasy, because that's primarily what I read and write, I'd be super excited to see that. I'm excited to see, I mean, obviously, more books by Jews from all walks of life, you know, Sephardic Jews, Jews of color. I feel like we've come a long way, and there's still a lot more to expansion to be done. So,
Spinning Silver was the book that I went into, and they were like, here's this girl and she's a money lender, and I was like, I'm scared. And then I like became completely obsessed. I read that book on the beach, which I really would not recommend reading it somewhere really hot and sunny. It's like an incredibly cold and wintry book. But yeah, I loved it's a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, but with a Jewish bent, and it's just, I felt so safe in that author's hands and Naomi's hands. Like and I think that that's really important, and something that I tried to carry in when I write complicated Jewish characters, is that like, this is going to be messy, but you Jewish reader are going to be safe. Like, I've got you. I am not going to let you down, is something that I think that I really took away from that book, that feeling that I don't think that I had felt before in a Jewish fantasy.
Yeah, I read that book after The City Beautiful. I worked on The City Beautiful, but I do feel like reading that book really made me consider even more the ways that I can. I was thinking of Frankie's character, because he also sort of hits some stereotypes, and he's ambitious, and he's a criminal. But it made me. It really made me appreciate the way that she allows her characters to be messy, and to not, she doesn't force them into these molds of what Jewish characters in fantasy and historical fantasy should look like, of what we think they should look like. And I've carried that forward through the other stories I've been working on as well.
Well, I think it has that quality that when you're writing or when you're reading a book about a member of a marginalized community, from a member of a marginalized community, that you can clearly see that this character is not messy because they're a member of that marginalization. They're messy because they're a human, they're a person. And that quality definitely comes across in those books, and I think in all of your books as well, Abby. Do we want to talk about when we decided to add our books to the genre of Jewish fantasy? How did you decide to approach that task? Knowing we were kind of like entering into a little bit of a limited genre, but something that was growing and something that means a lot to us.
Well, oh, I see. Were you?
No, I was thinking about how I wanted to answer, but go ahead.
No. So I actually didn't initially set out to write A Far Wilder Magic as a Jewish fantasy. Actually, y'all can thank Ava for the existence of Margaret. I kind of ran into this problem where I had kind of set up this this plot where the protagonist, Margaret, is very isolated in this community, and I couldn't figure out why. And there's like this kind of bully archetype villain who just hates her guts, and I'm like, I don't want to invent some elaborate backstory. Like, what could possibly have caused this animosity between them? And kind of, I was talking to Ava about this, and she's like, well, why don't you make Margaret Jewish? And I was like,
my answer to every problem.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, that's an interesting suggestion. And I started like thinking about it, and as soon as I kind of entertained that possibility, the theme of the book kind of cracked open. It's very much this book about community, who gets to be a hero. It's about finding belonging and shared not belonging with other people. It's about justice and how we deal with the people who hurt us. So yeah, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. So that was kind of my my initial foray into Jewish fantasy was kind of just like seeing where that would take me. And it was kind of, I also come from an interfaith family, patrilineal Jew, and it was because I felt like I didn't have a right to write that kind of story. So, Jewish fantasy just means the world to me because it's kind of allowed me to open myself up to these parts of myself that I had kind of not thought about in many years, just having been in a mostly, Catholic community. So thanks, A Far Wilder Magic. Thanks, Ava.
Well, it's really funny because I also didn't set out to write The Wolf and Woodsman as a Jewish fantasy book. I just wanted to write about medieval Hungary because it's like really interesting. And then I was in Pitch Wars, and when the mentees were announced, I remember I started talking on Twitter to people, and I'd never interacted with the book community before Pitch Wars. And I was talking to my dear, lovely friend, Victoria Lee, who we were not friends at the time. This is like our first interaction. And my mentor saw our conversation, and my mentor was like, why don't you write, this is like, why don't you write EBK as like a Jewish character? And I was like, oh, well, why not? I don't know. It's really interesting because at that point, I hadn't even read Spinning Silver yet. But that was like the only book that I could kind of like compare to what I was trying to do. So it felt like a proverbial leap of faith to do that. But I'm very glad that I did.
Are we all?
Yeah, for me, before The City Beautiful, I actually began working on Bone Weaver, the book that comes out this year. And at the time, I was really interested in Jewish history and Eastern European history, but I didn't feel ready to write an actually Jewish book set in, the real world. So that was really my way of sort of introducing these topics I wanted to discuss in The City Beautiful, and doing it in a fantasy setting. I felt like it really gave me sort of the leeway to explore themes like anti-Semitism and belonging and identity, especially the way that even the characters feel isolated within their own communities as well, or like they're not a part of their communities. So I definitely would say that was sort of my way to break ground in exploring these themes in The City Beautiful. I don't think that I would have had the confidence to work on The City Beautiful if not for Bone Weaver. And even as I was working on The City Beautiful, I often found myself forced to confront this sense that I'm not the right person to write this book. It's this character's observant. I'm not observant. This character is really Jewish. I'm not really Jewish. And that was something I found myself struggling with a lot in The City Beautiful, but it also eventually led me to really sort of embrace my identity and embrace the fact that kids need stories with Jewish characters who may not feel Jewish enough, or who may be struggling with parts of their identity, or which I don't really confront in The City Beautiful, but I eventually hope to confront in other stories as well.
I think for me, The Girl with the Red Balloon came out in 2017. I wrote it, I think, in 2013. And I had written 7 or 8 books before I wrote The Girl with the Red Balloon, none of which are published. The Girl with the Red Balloon was the first time I finished a book and thought, oh, this is good enough to be published. This is something I should try to get published. And I think the difference was it was the first time I wrote a Jewish character. So it's the first time that I really felt like I had unlocked a character and a story that was meaningful and deep and layered because I live the complexity of being a patrilineal Jew and growing up in a non-Jewish area and frequently being people's first Jew that they've ever met, but also like carrying with me all of that generational trauma. And I really wanted to write a book about how my relationship with my grandfather had really gone through a rough period when I said I was going to study in Ukraine. And he said, how could you go back to a place that hated us and killed us? So I wanted to kind of, he was not born in Ukraine, he was born in the US. So but he said it like it was present tense and happening to him. So I really wanted to explore a book that grappled with that feeling of going to a place that you love. Like I landed in Kyiv and immediately loved that city, like immediately felt at home in Ukraine and was completely aware at every turn that country did not love me back at all. In contemporary sense and murder your great-grandparent sense, like there was no love for me there. And I wanted to sit in that discomfort. And I think that because I had lived that discomfort and I knew that discomfort and that discomfort and that willingness to question, which I think is very Jewish, of questioning and saying there are no right answers and it's okay to feel complicated feelings about identity. I think that's why The Girl with the Red Balloon worked so well for me. And I think that is just something that I keep pushing on and getting braver with each book. And to the point where I'm like, okay, maybe write something commercial and sellable, Katie. But I think that, I think that's something that I'm still exploring of what's it like to love your identity in a world that doesn't always love that identity back. And looking at that from multiple points of view of being queer, of being Jewish, of being a privileged person in some spaces and a person who is more marginalized in other spaces. So yeah, I think that's how I approached it. And then I was hooked. Now I can't imagine writing a book without centering Jewish experiences and Jewish characters. At least at the novel level. Like my picture books are pretty not Jewish so far. But yeah, so at least at the novel level, it'd be hard for me to figure out how to write, like even on a secondary level, something that didn't feel Jewish.
Yeah, I think I came to it a little bit like Katie and Aden did. Where like every book that I had written up to this point, like gave me the tools and the bravery to write this book. And I've talked a little bit with Katie about how my last book before this, The Wise and the Wicked, was like not Jewish, but Jewish. Apparently looking back, it has like a lot of Slavic mythology, monsters and fantasy. It's a matrilineal family. There is a lot of discussion of like diaspora and what happens when you are forced to leave the place that you come from and what you lose when you don't speak the language of your ancestors and like basically every part of yourself that you had to leave behind, even though you've never been to this other place. So like it was getting there, but I finally decided to just write a Jewish book and like dive all the way in. And it was really interesting because I think I had a little bit of an opposite experience where I grew up in a conservative, not like politically conservative, but Jewish conservative household that was pretty observant. We were enmeshed, like really enmeshed in the synagogue, like went to Hebrew school. My mom taught Hebrew school. I loosely taught Hebrew school, mostly gave people like coloring pages in kindergarten and everything. But there were all these like rituals and like beliefs like Tikkun Olam and that I had just grown up like very like, okay, this is a thing that exists. Like we celebrate Shabbat, we are Jewish, da 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 da. And then my character grew up completely unaware of the fact that her, she was Jewish, did not know her mother was Jewish, until she found her family and discovered like this big observant Jewish community. And so I had to like explain or have this character who was never exposed to it and never grew up with those assumptions about herself. And she was questioning like everything, like what is the order of the Shabbat service? And what is the purpose of this? And what does it even mean to be Jewish? And do I consider myself Jewish? And so it was really interesting to explore a part of my identity that I had always just like taken for granted. And like, how would I explain that to somebody who had come to it from a place of like no awareness and was still trying to figure out how to integrate that into their own vision of themselves, which was really fascinating. And like a lot of you, I think, brought me a lot closer to like, I don't know, my religion and my community, even because I think I understand it a little better, as opposed to just like accepting it as a part of myself, but not really interrogating it ever. But I think that's awesome that we all kind of came to it from different angles, but got a lot of the same things out of the process.
We have a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Oh, should we like, we're like getting down to it.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions, so we can jump right into those because there are a lot of great ones. So a lot of people are just asking, what advice would you give to aspiring Jewish authors? And that could be for anyone.
Find other Jewish authors so you have friends to support you, because it can be a bit hostile sometimes. I mean, publishing is difficult for like literally everyone, but you know, in specific relation to your Jewish identity, it can be hostile, and there can be people who don't understand, and you know, there will be things you'll probably have to fight for and explain to people, and it's just nice to have like fellow Jewish authors in your corner when you do that.
Yeah.
To add off that, I would also say this is something I've recently given a lot of thought about, but prioritize your mental health when it comes to writing. I know that I just in part because of the way that rejection is basically a part of every step of the publishing process, but also the way that people can sort of weaponize your words and identity and what you put on the page. I think social media has sort of made a new battleground with that, and I think it's important also to just find a support system as you go through the publishing process.
I would just say that something that I had to like tell myself, and what I would tell to a Jewish writer, is you're not responsible for representing like the Jewish experience or the queer Jewish experience, or telling the Jewish story. Like, you are just responsible for representing a Jewish experience. And there are so many, and even folks within your own community, like, don't all have to agree on it. You just have to tell that one slice of the story. And there's room for so many stories and so many interpretations just in that genre.
Okay. Next question. Are there any periods of Jewish history that you haven't had a chance to dive into yet in your writing but want to explore in future works? Once again, directed towards anyone.
I'll jump in here because I have two. One, I really would like to write about the emancipation of Jews in England, because that was like such a major turning point in British politics and in Jewish life in Europe. So I'd love to write about that. But also, I am desperate. This is me throwing the idea into the universe, so someone should write this. I'm very, very desperate for like a New York Jewish mob mafia book that is like, I'm not going to write it, but I'm going to give you this detail that like my grandfather grew up, his family they needed protection from the mob. So they did favors for the Jewish mob. So like my grandfather and his sisters and his mother would count diamonds at night for the mob. And like that's like a thing they did as a family, is like they would sit around the table and like count diamonds together, because in his neighborhood you had to have that protection. It was the currency. And I just think that there's a really interesting Jewish history there, and we're finally at the point where you can write that without like Jewish people absolutely panicking about it and non-Jewish people being like, I knew it, the Jews were behind it all. So I feel like now is the right time for someone to write a really good, like great 20s Jewish mob book. So, and I will blurb it. Please send it to me. I will blurb it.
Yeah, my family were actually Jewish moonshiners during Prohibition. So there you go.
Please give us a.
I'm extremely tempted.
Aden, please.
I would die for that.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. You can answer that one.
I was just, ideas are coming slow lately, but I have a work in progress that I sincerely hope everyone gets to read eventually. That's like a early 19th century Germany inspired setting about like folklore and fairy tales, and it's such an interesting period of time with like the kind of Jewish Enlightenment period, where like it was just such a time like a lot of flux with secularization and the cost of assimilation and like Jewish intellectual life, and it was just so vibrant and interesting. So I'm begging on my hands and knees, publish it.
Oh, we're putting stuff out into the universe about our works in progress. I'll just say that I'm diving into early 19th century imperial Russia and the Pale of Settlement and the Second World fantasy version of the book. And it is really, really cool and fascinating. And I'm ready for a fantasy, another fantasy, there's others, but rooted in Slavic history, where anti-Semitism is like acknowledged and a significant factor in the story, instead of just like the thinly veiled thing underneath it.
Yeah, for me, well, I've been working on just a story set in Germany after the Cold War, and it has a Jewish main character whose family came from the Soviet Union. So that's been really really interesting to explore. It's a thriller, but hopefully someday it will get out in the world.
All right. Fingers crossed for all of those. All right. So our next question. Did you find yourself self-censoring as you were writing, as in this is too Jewish? And if so, how did you deal with that sense of tension within yourself and pushing past that to getting your vision on the page?
I kind of had in some ways the opposite experience of like, you know, am I Jewish enough to write this? And I guess that kind of like ties into any advice I would have for Jewish writers is like, yeah, as you've heard throughout this panel, this sense of dislocation, this questioning is kind of, I would almost argue, central to the Jewish experience. So always feel that you are enough to write your story. At certain points, I mean, like writing secondary world fantasy, it is kind of funny. Like I do straight up just put like, you know, Tikkun Olam in the book, and like literal, like just actual like Shabbat is in there. So it's like at certain points I felt like, is this too much? Is this too obvious? And yet I'll still get people who are like, this religion is so interesting. How did you come up with all of this?
Yes, there are people who still don't know that the Jews in the Wolf and Woodsman are Jews, and like I see reviews about it all the time, actually.
So I would just say, like, whether you're feeling like it's too much or not enough, just go for it, because it's going to resonate with the people who, I mean, the girls who get it, and the girls who don't. And I think you just have to write what brings you joy and what feels true to you.
I would love to hear Aden's answer to this, because I'm going to put you on the spot, Aden, because I read The City Beautiful and was like, literally furious that I didn't write this book. Like, I think it's like basically a perfect book to me. So literally furious that I didn't write it, but also was like Googling so many Yiddish words and words that I was like, I have no idea. Am I supposed to know whether this, like, did you get, I know who your editor was for the City Beautiful. So I have a hard time thinking that she would have pushed back on it, but did you have pushback on how Jewish your book is in that way?
Shockingly not from my publisher, my agent. But I do have a lot to say about this, because this was actually something that I struggled with in my own writing process, because not being religious, my first reaction to the story was, okay, he's not going to be religious either. He's not going to be practicing, but then that doesn't work for the plot. It doesn't work for his character. It doesn't work for the fact that he volunteers at a burial society, or for the fact that, he came from Romania and he's a recent immigrant. It would have gone completely against the historical record. And I'm actually so glad that I decided to make him observant, and I decided to bring in Yiddish, because it would have been a completely different story without it. I think it would have been very sanitized, very meant to cater to a non-Jewish audience. And as I was working on the story, I realized, am I afraid to make him Jewish because I'm afraid this book's not going to sell, or because it's going to be too Jewish to be a queer book, or it's going to be too Jewish to be a dark fantasy or gothic horror novel? And I think that slow process of realization and of embracing his identity, of realizing, it's fine if people don't know what this word means. I read plenty of fantasy books where you have to go along and figure out what the words mean, or where you come across a word that, okay, do you really need to know the definition of this word? Can it be inferred through text? Can you just gloss over it and eventually come to a realization of what that word means? And yeah, I definitely say that made me confront how I read books, and the sort of leeway that I give other books that I wasn't willing to give to my own writing.
Okay. So our next question, I know that we just kind of said finding what you want to write and finding that balance, but I think this is an interesting question. So do you ever struggle between wanting to write in a way that speaks directly to a Jewish audience and feeling a need to translate certain experiences, traditions, languages for non-Jewish readers, or how do you find that balance?
I think the balance is hard to find, and everyone's balance is different. So like what you might consider balance in your book might not be balance for a reader, and you have to just go with what works best for you. I write for my ideal reader for the book who may or may not be Jewish. Like I would say that for The Girl with the Red Balloon, it resonated very well with Jewish readers, but I actually was thinking about a Gentile reader reading that. But with like The Spy with the Red Balloon and This Rebel Heart, I was like, this is for Jewish people. Keep up if you can. If you can't, that's okay. But that's like one of the reasons why I really push back against no glossaries in my book, no pronunciation guide. And we got that question with It's a Whole Spiel as well. Like, do we want to standardize? We actually got really interesting questions with that book. Like, do we want to standardize the spelling of Hanukkah in It's a Whole Spiel? And we actually said no, because we wanted each author to transliterate it the way that they felt comfortable transliterating it and not enforcing a certain transliteration. But I think it's also just about being confident that when you send that book out, you've done the best job that you can do, and you have to let go. Like you're going to get DMs from Jewish readers and Jewish reviewers that say, you transliterated this differently than I would have transliterated this. Why did you put a comma between these two transliterated words? And you'll be like, I was really tired and they added the comma in past pages. And at that point I was like, sure, a comma there looks great. You have to just kind of be like, I did the best I could and I did a Jewish experience that was true to me. And it doesn't matter if it is a different Jewish experience than what you think a Jewish experience is, regardless of whether that reader is Jewish or Gentile. So yeah, it's just about having a lot of self-confidence in your work. And I don't read my reviews because that's how I maintain my self-confidence and my pride in my work, by not reading my reviews.
Yeah. I mean, like Aden said, this is an industry where rejection is just like every day, basically, in some form or another. You have to deal with it. Again, like, find your people. And, you know, there's an agent who refused to represent my book unless I quote, literally direct quote, took out all the Jewish elements. And then also said that I was anti-Semitic because one Jewish character had once minted coins. And I was like, I have something really unfortunate to tell you about Jews in medieval Europe. And I was really, really upset about that. And that was like one of my first experiences with rejection in the industry. But, you know, I found a lot of support. I found my people, and now it's just kind of a wild, funny story. So
I just think personally, I was not worried about whether, like, I wasn't really worried about what Gentile readers were going to think of like the Jewishness of my book. I was a lot more worried about what Jewish readers, especially those who were maybe like more observant than I am, even though I grew up observant and still observe. I was worried what Jewish readers were going to think about my book. And I had a bit of a panic moment in the ARC. And this is not my publishers, this is nobody's fault, but in the ARC, there's a couple instances of like Hebrew in the Hebrew language rather than transliterated. And they had switched the font, the direction, so that everything was backwards. And I had such a panic moment because I was like, Jewish reviewers are going to read this book and they're going to think I don't know like my ass from my elbow, that I like am just out here willy-nilly spelling Jewish words backwards. But again, it goes back to that, like, I'm not responsible for telling a story that directly reflects every Jewish reader's experience or interpretation of events or feelings towards their religion or practices. People are a mishmash of practices. And so again, it was like, just like talking myself down from feeling such responsibility that everybody who was the same faith as me had to see themselves in my story. That's like too much responsibility. And once I got over that and got over myself, it went a lot better.
All right, so we are right at 8 o'clock, and that means we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank all of you so much for being here tonight. And as always, don't forget to purchase a copy of any of the books that were mentioned tonight. We have links sent in the chat box, so you can easily click on those to purchase your books, or you can come visit us in store. Again, thank you so much to Ava, Rebecca, Allison, Catherine, and Aden. We're so happy to have you here tonight, and I hope you all have a great rest of your night.
Thank you
so much.